The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft amber glow over the sleepy town of Cedar Grove. Malik Johnson's sneakers hit the pavement in a steady rhythm, his breath in sync with each stride. The early morning streets were quiet, empty except for the occasional car passing by, but Malik preferred it that way. Running had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape from the world and its burdens, if only for a little while. As he rounded the corner onto Maple Street, memories of his childhood flooded his mind. He could almost hear the voice of his father, deep and booming, encouraging him to run like the wind, son. Run like the wind. Those words echoed in Malik's head every time he laced up his shoes. His father, Samuel Johnson, had been a strong man, a pillar of their community, until the day he wasn't. Malik's father had been killed when Malik was only 8 years old. The incident was seared into his memory. A routine traffic stop gone wrong, fueled by racial tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of Cedar Grove for years. It wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of the dangers that came with being a black man in America. From that day on, Malik had carried his father's spirit with him in every race, every sprint down the block. It wasn't just about speed anymore, it was about survival. His mother, Linda, had taken over the mantle of strength after Samuel's death. She worked tirelessly, cleaning houses and doing odd jobs just to keep food on the table. She never complained, never wavered. Malik admired her more than anyone else in the world, and it was for her that he pushed himself harder every day. He wanted to give her something to be proud of, something to make all her sacrifices worth it. But it wasn't just his mother who inspired him. His grandfather, James, a proud civil rights activist from the 60s, had filled Malik's head with stories of struggle and resistance. "You gotta fight, Malik," James would tell him, his eyes gleaming with fire. "You gotta fight for every inch in this world, especially when they try to take it from you." It was from his grandfather that Malik inherited his resilience, his refusal to give up even when the odds were stacked against him. Malik ran faster now, pushing his body to its limit, the cool morning air stinging his lungs. He had big dreams, dreams that had begun to seem just out of reach. There was a major marathon coming up, one that could put him on the map. He'd been training for months, but the obstacles seemed to pile up one after another. No sponsorships, no big-name coaches, nothing but his determination to push forward. The world wasn't built for someone like him to succeed, but he'd make his own way. As he neared the end of his run, Malik slowed to a jog, his heart still pounding in his chest. The town was waking up now, but he didn't need anyone to see him, didn't need any applause. He had learned early on that the world didn't cheer for people like him unless they were winning medals or breaking records. But Malik wasn't just running for medals. He was running for something much deeper, for his father, for his mother, for his grandfather, and for himself. Stopping at the corner of his street, Malik bent over, hands on his knees, and caught his breath. His muscles ached, but it was a good kind of pain, the kind that reminded him of how far he'd come. He glanced down the road where his small house sat at the end of the block. Inside, his mother would be getting ready for her first job of the day, the same routine she had followed for years. One day, Malik promised himself he would make sure she never had to work again. He would win this marathon, not just for the prize money, but for everything it symbolized: freedom, dignity, the chance to rewrite his story, and the stories of those who came before him. As he straightened up, Malik turned his gaze to the horizon. The sun had fully risen now, bathing Cedar Grove in a golden light. It was a new day, and Malik was ready for whatever it would bring. Malik wiped the sweat from his brow as he entered the local running store. The air conditioning hit his skin, a stark contrast to the humid air outside. He needed new shoes. His current pair had seen better days after months of pounding the pavement. As he browsed the shelves, he overheard a conversation at the counter. "Did you see the lineup for the marathon next month? Ethan Miller's running again," the store clerk said, excitement clear in his voice. Malik froze for a moment, his attention now fully on the conversation. "Yeah, man," the other replied. "Ethan's gonna crush it. No one can touch him." Ethan Miller, the golden boy of the marathon circuit, with sponsors and a support team most athletes could only dream of. He was the complete opposite of Malik, privileged, polished, and with all the advantages money could buy. Malik had seen him in a few local races, always surrounded by fans and press. It wasn't just that Ethan was fast. He had the backing of an entire system that seemed designed to make sure he stayed on top. Malik clenched his jaw, trying to push the thought aside. He wasn't competing for attention or fame. He just wanted his shot to show the world what he could do. But the reality was that getting into a race of this caliber without sponsorships or a big name behind you was nearly impossible. Malik had scraped together enough for the entry fee, but that wasn't enough to guarantee a spot in the race. He grabbed a pair of shoes and headed to the counter, trying not to think about Ethan or the hurdles ahead. But just as he was about to pay, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Coach Sanders, his current trainer. "We need to talk. Meet me at the track ASAP." The message was short and cryptic, and Malik's stomach twisted with unease. He paid for the shoes quickly and rushed out of the store, heart pounding again. But not from the run this time. By the time he got to the track, Coach Sanders was already waiting, arms crossed, looking unusually tense. Malik approached cautiously, his nerves on edge. "Coach, what's going on?" Malik asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sanders hesitated, then let out a deep sigh. "Malik, I've been talking to the race organizers. There's been an issue with your entry." Malik's heart sank. "What do you mean, an issue?" "They're saying you don't meet the qualifications," Sanders explained, avoiding Malik's gaze. "No sponsorships, no major wins in the last year. They're tightening the rules." "Tightening the rules," Malik echoed, his voice rising with frustration. "They let people like Ethan Miller in with no problem. Why is it different for me?" Sanders looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. Malik knew what this was. It wasn't about qualifications. It was about who the system valued. Ethan, with his wealthy background and spotless reputation, fit the mold of who they wanted in the spotlight. Malik, from a small, working-class black family, did not. "They want you to reapply," Sanders finally said. "But it's not looking good, Malik. I don't want to give you false hope." Malik felt a wave of anger rising in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't afford to lose control now. "What are my options?" he asked, voice tight. "You'll need a sponsor," Sanders said, "or someone with influence to vouch for you. Otherwise, it's unlikely they'll let you in." Malik stood there staring at the ground, his mind racing. He didn't have connections in the running world. He didn't have anyone in his corner besides his family and a few local supporters. But there had to be a way. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. "I'll figure something out," Malik said, determination hardening in his voice. Sanders looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know you will, but it's going to be tough. Just be ready for that." Malik left the track, his mind churning. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he refused to let it crush him. He had come too far to turn back now. Ethan Miller and the others might have the system on their side, but Malik had something they didn't: grit, and he was going to need every ounce of it to get through this. He spent the next few days reaching out to anyone he could think of, local business owners, community leaders, even family friends, hoping someone could help. But every call, every meeting ended the same way. People wished him well, said they admired his determination, but no one was willing or able to sponsor him for such a high-profile race. The frustration was mounting, but Malik pushed through it. He kept training, kept running every morning, kept searching for a way in. It wasn't just about proving himself. It was about breaking down the barriers that had been set up to keep people like him out. Finally, after days of dead ends, Malik got a call from an unexpected source: the Cedar Grove Community Foundation, a small but influential group dedicated to supporting local talent, had heard about his situation. They weren't a major sponsor by any means, but they wanted to help. "We've been watching you for a while, Malik," the foundation's representative said over the phone. "We know what you're up against, and we believe in you. We'll sponsor your entry fee and help cover your travel expenses." Malik's chest tightened with emotion. It wasn't the big break he had been hoping for, but it was enough. It was a start. "Thank you," Malik said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You don't know how much this means to me." "We know," the representative replied. "Now go show them what you're made of." With the foundation's support, Malik was officially entered in the race. It wasn't going to be easy. He was still up against competitors with far more resources and advantages, but he was in, and that was all he needed, just a chance. As he laced up his new shoes the next morning, Malik felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, and the obstacles were many, But for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could win this. Malik leaned against the chain-link fence of the track, his breath coming in sharp gasps as pain radiated from his knee. He had been pushing himself harder than ever, determined to make every second of training count, now that he was officially entered in the marathon. But his body was beginning to rebel, and this time, it wasn't just soreness. It was something deeper, something that threatened to undo all his hard work. He glanced down at his leg, feeling the dull ache settle into a throb. It wasn't the first time he had felt this pain, but today it was different. More intense, more dangerous. "Hey, you good?" Coach Sanders called from the sideline, concern etched into his face. Malik straightened up, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, just a little sore. Nothing I can't handle." But Sanders wasn't convinced. He'd been coaching long enough to recognize when an athlete was hiding something. He walked over, his expression grim. "Let me see," Sanders said, kneeling down and inspecting Malik's knee. Malik winced as Sanders pressed lightly on the swollen area. It had been bothering him for weeks, but he'd pushed through, unwilling to lose precious training time. Now, as Sanders stood back up, the look on his face told Malik what he didn't want to hear. "You're not just sore," Sanders said, his tone serious. "This is more than overuse. You need to rest." "Rest," Malik echoed, frustration bubbling up. "Coach, the race is in a month. I don't have time to rest." Sanders crossed his arms. "And if you push it too far, you won't even make it to the starting line. You need to be smart about this." Malik ran a hand over his face, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. He knew Sanders was right, but the thought of slowing down now when everything was on the line made his stomach twist with anxiety. "I can't afford to stop," Malik muttered, more to himself than to Sanders. "I've come too far." Sanders softened his stance, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "I know this means everything to you, but you've got to listen to your body. If you don't, it's going to force you to stop, whether you like it or not." The words hit Malik harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on his resilience, his ability to push through pain and keep moving forward no matter what. But now, as he stood there, the throbbing in his knee a constant reminder of his limitations, doubt crept in. What if he couldn't do it? What if his body gave out before he even had a chance to prove himself? He nodded reluctantly, knowing that resting was his only real option. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll take it easy for a couple of days." But even as he said the words, he knew he wouldn't be able to rest for long. There was too much at stake. Over the next few days, Malik tried to follow Sanders' advice. He cut back on his runs, focused on strength training and stretching, but the nagging worry about his knee never left him. Each morning, as he watched the other runners hit the track while he stood on the sidelines, a deep frustration settled in his chest. Every day he rested felt like a day lost, a day his competitors were getting stronger while he fell behind. It didn't help that Ethan Miller's name seemed to be everywhere. The media had already crowned him the likely winner of the marathon, with headlines that praised his perfect form and unshakable confidence. Malik could barely turn on his phone without seeing another article or interview featuring Ethan, his smug face reminding Malik of everything he was up against. The pressure was mounting, and Malik felt it in every fiber of his being. One evening, after another frustrating session at the gym, where he couldn't even run without pain, Malik sat in his living room staring at the TV. His mother, Linda, had just come home from work and was watching him with quiet concern. "You've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately," she said gently, sitting down beside him. Malik sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't have a choice, Mom. This is my only shot." Linda reached out and took his hand, her eyes filled with the same warmth and strength that had carried their family through so many hard times. "I know how much this means to you," she said softly. "But you have to take care of yourself, Malik. If you don't, what's all this for?" Malik shook his head, feeling the weight of her words, but not wanting to accept them. "If I don't win this race, nothing else matters." Linda frowned, her grip tightening on his hand. "Winning isn't everything, baby. You're already doing more than most people ever dream of. You've got to trust yourself, and trust that you're enough, no matter what happens." Malik looked away, not sure how to respond. His mother had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. But this was different. This wasn't just about belief. It was about proving to the world, to himself, that he could break through the barriers holding him back. That night, as Malik lay in bed, the pain in his knee a dull throb beneath the sheets. His mind raced with doubts. What if he couldn't recover in time? What if all this training had been for nothing? What if, after everything, he still wasn't good enough? He rolled over, staring at the ceiling, his chest tight with anxiety. There was no turning back now. The marathon was weeks away, and he was running out of time. But one thing was clear. He couldn't give up. Not after everything he had sacrificed. Not after everything his family had sacrificed. He just had to find a way to keep going. The sound of Malik's feet hitting the track echoed in his ears. The rhythm, a steady distraction from the pain that had become a constant companion. His knee wasn't fully healed, but with the marathon only a few weeks away, he couldn't afford to take more time off. He had cut his runs shorter, focusing on technique and mental endurance, but the pressure was mounting. He needed to push through, and he knew it. That morning, Coach Sanders had called an early session at the track. Malik had shown up, eager to get in as much training as possible. But as the sun crept higher in the sky, a nagging sense of unease settled in his stomach. Sanders was acting strangely, more distant, less encouraging than usual. And something in the way he avoided eye contact made Malik's skins prickle with suspicion. After an hour of drills, Sanders finally walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. His face was unreadable, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something more guarded. "We need to talk," Sanders said, his voice low and serious. Malik stopped mid-stride, wiping the sweat from his own brow and looking at the coach with narrowed eyes. "About what?" Sanders hesitated, then glanced around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "It's about your race entry." Malik's chest tightened. "What about it? I thought everything was settled after the foundation came through with the sponsorship." Sanders exhaled slowly, his gaze finally meeting Malik's. "There's been a problem. The organizers are reviewing your eligibility again. They're claiming there might be an issue with your entry, something about your qualifications." Malik's heart sank. "What qualifications? I met all the requirements." Sanders shifted uncomfortably. "They're saying your past races don't count toward the ranking they're looking for. And there's been a lot of talk about certain runners getting preferential treatment." Malik's jaw clenched. "Ethan Miller, you mean?" Sanders didn't respond immediately, but the silence was answer enough. Malik could feel the anger rising inside him, hot and sharp. He had fought tooth and nail to get into this race, and now it seemed like the system was trying to push him out again. The fact that Ethan Miller, with his perfect record and endless sponsorships, was getting a free pass while Malik's entry was being questioned, felt like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Malik demanded, his voice tight with frustration. "I just found out myself," Sanders said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I've been hearing things, Malik. Rumors that some of the organizers are being pressured by certain sponsors to keep the race clean." "Clean," Malik repeated, his tone bitter. He knew what that word really meant. They wanted to keep the race free of controversy, free of people like him. "I'm working on it," Sanders continued, trying to sound reassuring. "I've got some contacts in the industry who might be able to help clear this up, but it's complicated. You're not exactly the kind of runner they want to highlight." Malik's mind raced, but one thought stuck out above the rest. He had been fighting against the odds his whole life, and now, just as he was on the verge of something big, the system was trying to shut him out again. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. "I can't believe this," Malik muttered, shaking his head. "I've done everything right. I've trained, I've worked hard, and they're still trying to push me out." Sanders looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "It's not just them," he said quietly. "There's more." Malik frowned. "What do you mean?" Sanders hesitated again, his expression pained. Malik, I've been working with some of the sponsors. They're the ones questioning your entry. They're worried about your image, about how it reflects on the race." The words hit Malik like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't process what Sanders was saying. His own coach, the person he had trusted to guide him through this journey, had been working with the very people trying to shut him out. "You've got to be kidding me," Malik said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been talking to them? Behind my back?" "I didn't have a choice," Sanders said quickly, holding up his hands defensively. "They put me in a tough position. I thought I could smooth things over, but it's gotten out of control." "Out of control?" Malik snapped, his voice rising. "You've been sabotaging me this whole time, haven't you? Pretending to help while making sure I wouldn't get too far. Is that it?" "No," Sanders insisted, but Malik wasn't listening. His blood was boiling, the betrayal cutting deeper than any injury ever could. "I trusted you," Malik said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I thought you were on my side." "I am," Sanders protested, "but you don't understand how this world works. It's not just about talent, Malik. It's about connections, about who fits the narrative they want to sell. And right now, they don't think you fit." Malik felt his hands balling into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose his temper. Not now. He needed a clear head if he was going to figure a way out of this. "So what do I do?" Malik asked, his voice strained. "Just roll over and let them take this from me?" "No," Sanders said, his voice softening. "You fight. You keep doing what you've been doing. But I'm telling you, it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to push harder than ever before." Malik nodded, though his mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The very people who were supposed to support him were actively working against him, and his own coach had been part of it. But that didn't change his goal. He was going to run in that marathon, and he was going to prove that he belonged there, no matter who tried to stop him. "I'll figure it out," Malik said finally, turning away from Sanders. "With or without you." He didn't wait for a response. He walked off the track, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and determination. The betrayal stung, but it also fueled him. If they thought they could break him, they were wrong. As he left the stadium, Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from the Cedar Grove Community Foundation. "We've got your back, Malik. We'll help you get through this." Malik exhaled slowly, feeling a surge of relief. He wasn't completely alone. There were still people who believed in him. And with that, he knew, no matter what Sanders or the race organizers tried to throw at him, he was going to make it to the starting line. The day of the marathon arrived with a crisp, clear morning, the kind of day where the air felt alive with possibility. But Malik's nerves were on edge. Standing at the starting line, surrounded by runners from all over the country, he couldn't shake the feeling of the uphill battle he'd fought just to get here. His knee was wrapped tightly beneath his running shorts, the dull ache ever present, a reminder of the limits he was pushing. But the pain was the least of his worries. Ahead of him, the media was already swarming around Ethan Miller, the golden boy of the race. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for interviews, and Ethan, with his flawless smile and effortless charm, soaked up the attention. For weeks, the headlines had painted him as the inevitable champion, untouchable, unbeatable. But Malik wasn't here for the cameras. He wasn't here for the accolades. He was here for himself, for his family, and for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The Cedar Grove Community Foundation had pulled through for him, ensuring his entry was secure despite the attempts to disqualify him. And that support meant more to him than anything the sponsors or media could offer. As the announcer's voice boomed over the crowd, signaling the final moments before the race began, Malik's heart raced in time with the ticking clock. He looked over at Ethan, who hadn't so much as glanced his way since the runners had gathered. Malik could see the confidence radiating off him. But underneath it, there was something else. Ethan had never been truly tested. Everything had always come easy for him. Malik, on the other hand, had fought for every inch. "Runners, to your marks!" Malik crouched down, feeling the tension in his muscles coil, ready to spring. His mind quieted, focused on the road ahead. This was it. The starting gun fired, and the sea of runners surged forward. The sound of hundreds of feet pounding the pavement filled the air, but Malik tuned it out, concentrating on his pace. He wasn't aiming to start fast. He needed to conserve his energy for later, knowing full well that the real test would come in the final miles. Ethan, predictably, shot out ahead, his long strides effortlessly carrying him to the front of the pack. Malik let him go. He had a plan, and it didn't involve chasing Ethan in the first mile. Instead, he found his rhythm, steady and strong, focusing on maintaining his breathing and keeping his mind sharp. The first few miles passed in a blur. Malik's body settled into the familiar routine of long-distance running, each step carrying him further from the noise of the crowd and deeper into his own head. His knee ached, but the pain was manageable, for now. As the runners spread out along the course, the race began to reveal its true nature. The weather, once cool and refreshing, grew warmer as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Malik could feel the heat seeping into his skin, and the pavement beneath his feet seemed to pulse with every step. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythm of his breathing and the steady beat of his heart. Around mile 12, Ethan was still ahead, but Malik could see that he wasn't as far as he had been earlier. The gap between them had started to close. The lead Ethan had established early on was shrinking, and for the first time, Malik saw a flicker of doubt cross Ethan's face as he glanced over his shoulder. Malik felt a surge of determination. He could catch him. He could do this. By mile 15, Malik had drawn even closer, and the crowd that lined the streets began to take notice. People were starting to cheer his name, the underdog they hadn't expected to see challenging the race favorite. Malik pushed harder, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts as he edged closer to Ethan. At mile 18, they were neck and neck. Ethan, who had been coasting for most of the race, suddenly found himself matched step for step. Malik could feel Ethan's frustration as they jostled for position, neither willing to back down. "Nice of you to finally show up," Ethan said between labored breaths, his voice laced with sarcasm. Malik didn't respond. He didn't have the energy for banter. His focus was singular: keep moving, keep pushing. He wasn't here to play mind games. For the next few miles they ran side by side, the tension between them palpable. Every muscle in Malik's body screamed for relief, but he refused to slow down. He had come too far. He thought of his mother, his grandfather, of the people in Cedar Grove who believed in him. They were with him in every step. As they neared the final stretch, the crowd's cheers grew deafening. Malik could barely hear his own thoughts over the roar, but he didn't need to think anymore. His body had taken over, moving on pure instinct and determination. And then, at mile 24, it happened. Ethan stumbled. It was a small misstep, a falter in his usually flawless form, but it was enough. Malik seized the opportunity, surging forward with everything he had left. Ethan tried to recover, but it was too late. Malik had taken the lead. The final 2 miles were the hardest of Malik's life. His legs felt like lead, his knees screaming with every step. But the finish line was in sight. The roar of the crowd blurred into white noise, and all Malik could see was the ribbon stretched across the end of the road. With one last push, Malik crossed the finish line. He didn't win. Ethan recovered quickly enough to finish just seconds ahead of him, taking first place by a narrow margin. But as Malik stumbled across the line, gasping for breath, the weight of the race washed over him. He had done it. He had finished. And in the eyes of everyone watching, he was a champion. The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, the cameras turned to Malik. He was no longer the runner everyone ignored. He was the man who had gone toe-to-toe with the favorite, the man who had fought for every step. As he stood there, chest heaving, he realized something important. This race, this moment, it was never about beating Ethan Miller. It was about proving to himself and the world that he belonged. And he had done that more than anyone ever expected. The moment Malik crossed the finish line, time seemed to slow. His legs wobbled beneath him, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion it had been fighting off for the last few miles. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, and for a moment, the world around him blurred. All he could hear was the pounding of his heart, the rush of blood in his ears, and the distant roar of the crowd. Someone handed him a bottle of water, but Malik barely noticed. He took a long drink, the cool liquid soothing his dry throat, but his mind was still catching up to what had just happened. He hadn't won the race, not technically, but as he stood there surrounded by cheers and applause, he realized that victory wasn't always about coming in first. It was about finishing, about proving to himself and to everyone watching that he belonged on this stage. He glanced over at Ethan Miller, who was surrounded by reporters and photographers. Ethan had crossed the line just ahead of him, officially taking first place. But something had shifted. Ethan's victory didn't feel as monumental as it had been made out to be. The cameras had finally turned toward Malik, capturing the story of the runner who had defied the odds. As the crowd swelled around them, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Malik, over here!" Malik turned and saw his mother pushing through the throngs of people, her face beaming with pride. His heart swelled at the sight of her, and when she finally reached him, she threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You did it," Linda whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Malik held her close, feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about this race. It was about everything that had led him here. The long hours of training, the sleepless nights filled with doubt, the barriers he had faced both on and off the track. He had carried the weight of his family's sacrifices with him, and now, standing here with his mother's arms around him, it felt like that weight had finally lifted. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," Malik said quietly, pulling back just enough to look her in the eyes. "Everything you've done for me, this is for you." Linda smiled, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "You're going to change things, Malik. I know it." Malik wasn't sure about changing the world, but he knew that this moment, this race, had already changed him. He had come into this marathon with something to prove, but what he hadn't realized was that he didn't need anyone's validation. He didn't need the sponsors or the media to recognize his worth. He had already proven it to himself, and that was enough. As the celebration continued around him, Malik spotted members of the Cedar Grove Community Foundation waving to him from the sidelines. He waved back, his heart full of gratitude. Without them, he wouldn't have even made it to the starting line. They had believed in him when no one else had, and now he was determined to repay that faith. Later, after the crowds had begun to thin and the awards ceremony had concluded, Malik found himself standing alone at the edge of the track. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden light over the city, and for the first time in what felt like days, he allowed himself to just breathe. He thought about his grandfather, about the stories of resistance and resilience that had shaped him. James Johnson had always said that the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and Malik now understood that in a way he hadn't before. This race had been a metaphor for his entire life, for the lives of so many who had come before him. The struggle didn't end at the finish line. It was just another step in a much longer journey. Malik knew he couldn't stop here. The marathon was just the beginning. There were other races to run, other barriers to break down, and he wasn't going to do it alone. He had a community behind him, a family that had always lifted him up, and now more than ever, he wanted to give back. A week after the race, Malik found himself back in Cedar Grove, standing on the local track where it had all started. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of young runners, boys and girls from the neighborhood, stood before him, their faces full of excitement and possibility. Malik had reached out to the Community Foundation, and together they had organized a youth running program to help the next generation of athletes find their own paths. "All right, everyone," Malik called, clapping his hands to get their attention. "Today we're going to focus on pacing. It's not about who's the fastest, it's about who can keep going." The kids listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration. Malik saw pieces of himself in each of them, remembering how it felt to be young and full of dreams, but unsure of how to make them a reality. As the kids started their warm-up laps, Malik jogged alongside them, offering tips and encouragement. He felt a sense of peace here, surrounded by the next generation of runners. He had always believed that running was more than just a sport. It was a way to break free, to rise above the limits that the world tried to place on you. And now he was passing that belief on to these kids, giving them the tools they needed to carve out their own futures. When the session ended, one of the younger boys, no more than 12 years old, ran up to Malik, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Johnson," the boy said breathlessly, "do you think I could ever run in a big race like you?" Malik crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "You can do anything you set your mind to," he said, his voice steady. "But remember, it's not just about winning, it's about finishing. It's about proving to yourself that you can do it." The boy nodded, a determined look crossing his face. "I'll remember that." As the boy ran off to join the others, Malik stood up, watching them with a sense of pride. This, more than any race or trophy, was what mattered. Passing on the lessons he had learned, making sure the next generation knew that they, too, belonged. The sun began to set over Cedar Grove, casting long shadows across the track. Malik took one last deep breath, feeling the warmth of the day settle into his bones. His journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. And as he turned to leave, He knew that wherever his path led, he would carry with him the strength of his family, his community, and the countless runners who had come before him. This was only the beginning.